thanks so much for inviting us here, that we really value, going to different groups, especially David, he travels around the country talking to different faith groups, different universities, different community groups, etc. And we value the experience of coming to your organization or collective of organizations and faith groups to talk about the issues that we find so important in regards to mass incarceration, and in this case, with the specification on race. So thank you so much. Sorry about that. How funny that I was just blathering on and nobody could hear me. We don't have a lot of time tonight, so I think I will just get started if that's okay. I like to start with a chart. It's really interesting to me to actually see the visual, the graphic. I think we're all very familiar with, or more or less familiar with specific statistics, and they can also be very impactful and important to know. But I really like the visual of seeing the graph where you can see where essentially the rates of incarceration remain pretty static until 1980, and then they skyrocket upwards. I think one thing that's important to point out is that numbers tell us a lot, but that they don't tell us everything. They don't. They really can't take into account the residual impacts of what the numbers mean, the long-lasting impact of incarceration. And even when people get out of jail or out of prison, they continue to be affected by, for example, disenfranchisement, employment issues, having to check the box, discriminatory practices in terms of education, getting loans, being eligible for certain social programs and low-income housing projects and things like that. So I think it's important to look at the numbers and look at the graphs and talk about the statistics. We keep in mind that they don't tell us everything. So basically, a quintuple, the rates of incarceration in a 40-year period quintupled. And then again, it's always important and interesting to see how we measure up globally, and how we got this reputation in this country of being the greatest incarcerator or the incarceration nation, and that we actually have the biggest prison population in the history of the world, and very specifically the biggest, blackest prison population in the history of the world. And just one more, well, actually, there's going to be two more charts. I like to look at it in terms of Pennsylvania. It's always important to see how our state measures up, nationally and internationally. And here's the interesting thing about Pennsylvania is that we're actually, when you look at the national standard of incarceration, we're just slightly, we're about average, actually. But don't celebrate yet. I'll tell you why in a second. So for example, the national standard out of 100,000, which is how they determine these things, Pennsylvania is at 659. So 659 people out of 100,000 incarcerated. You might want to guess if this was a smaller group, or if we were in person, we could be a little more interactive, but in your mind, just sort of try to guess what you think the worst states in the nation are, and then the best states are. So the worst states with the highest incarceration rate are Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Mississippi. And I don't know if this will surprise you, the three states with the lowest incarceration rates are Vermont, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. However, don't celebrate. As I said, don't celebrate yet, because when you factor in other forms of carceral control, such as parole and probation, then guess what, everybody? Pennsylvania actually plummets to the second worst, the second highest numbers. So I would consider that the second worst state in the nation when you add in probation and parole, carceral, the larger scope of carceral control, which is actually really interesting, because then you can really think about how, what kind of public policies or what kind of legislation are important to support, legislation aimed at, changing the laws around probation and parole, for example. So Black state residents are 11% Black residents in Pennsylvania, but represent 47% of the state population. Prison population. And by the way, these numbers, this is really important, they do not include numbers for ICE, of which there are 200 detention centers around the country. Right here in central Pennsylvania, right outside Phillipsburg, a new one opened up in October. Other things to consider when we look at these statistics are that Pennsylvania also has the highest percentage of people on parole, 1 out of 7. People in parole in the entire country are here in Pennsylvania, and nearly half of all admissions to prison are for technical parole violations. So again, think about that in terms of legislation and policy. Nearly 7 out of 10 new commitments are for nonviolent offenses, and this is kind of a sobering number. 2/3 of all inmates are also parents. And then just one more chart, guys. And unfortunately, I think the way Zoom is set up, it might be slightly obscured. Part of it might be slightly obscured, but I can't help that. We can't help that. I personally think it's important to take the binary when we want to factor in considerations of race, take it out of the black and white binary, and then you're looking at things like Native American men incarcerated at a rate 38% higher than the national average. Native American women are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of Caucasian women. And this might surprise you that actually it's Native Americans who are the most likely to be killed by the police than any other racial group. Moving on. So I think in order to sort of really explain a phenomena that, that at least by looking at the graph and the numbers seems to have started in the 80s, the 1980s, that we really have to take into account that, the idea that no era is built from a clean slate. We don't start from just a clean slate. Rather, each era is layered on top of earlier practices, values, and physical structures. So while we emphasize the 1980s as a starting place to pinpoint mass incarceration, to understand the modern phenomena of incarceration, we have to start the story much earlier. And believe it or not, in order to truly understand, this modern phenomena of race, imprisonment, and racialized policing, we'd actually have to go back to when the first set of shackles was used to subdue an African captive on the long passage across the Atlantic Ocean. However, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll start with the 13th Amendment. So as you can see, when slavery is abolished, the 13th Amendment states that, except as punishment for crime. Moving on. So now we have this idea of when slavery is abolished, following emancipation, there are two new sets of laws and two new practices and new sets of codes were created called the Black Codes and the convict leasing system. And these were created specifically to target newly freed slaves, and they worked in tandem together. So in the aftermath of slavery, Southern states, they quickly hastened to develop a criminal justice system that could legally restrict possibilities for freedom and economic freedom and political participation for newly released slaves. And Black people became the prime target for this new, developing system of convict leasing, and also the target of Black codes. So Black code violations were, and we'll talk a little bit more about what they were specifically in a minute, they were punishable by incarceration. So if you violated a Black code, which were, a series and set of laws and statutes, and every state had them, every municipality had their own. You can do research and say what South Carolina's Black codes were, what particular cities in these states were. They tended to be similar, but they're all a little specific to the region. And so they were punishable by incarceration. If you violated a Black code, it was punishable by incarceration, and that worked in tandem with the convict leasing system. So, all these laws were aimed specifically at Black people to be able to easily arrest them. And once they're arrested, they could be hired with the convict leasing system for extremely cheaply. The prison would rent them out, essentially, lease them out essentially for the day or for a period of time, and to hire in agriculture work or other needed labor. And thereby, by doing that in tandem, these two systems essentially recreated the economic and social relations of slavery. So some examples of Black codes are, and these are just really basic ones. couldn't own property or guns, no voting rights. If you didn't have a job, you could be arrested and forced to work for pay. They could be many things. It could be vagrancy. They could be, for getting together, for convening in large groups in public, more than 5 people, for trying to work a professional job that you didn't have a permit to work and couldn't get a permit because that was against the code as well, for not being employed, for being being out after dark in certain towns. I'm sure you've heard of the term sundown town. Well, that's what it comes from. It comes from Black codes, where it was literally illegal in many cities and towns across, the South and the North, for that matter, for Black people to be out after dark. For example, about 30 miles from where I live now in Huntington, Pennsylvania, it is a sundown town, or was, although, you can really still actually feel the vibe of it sometimes. And so in a very short time, the population of the prison shifted demographically. Now, the numbers didn't necessarily rise tremendously, but the demographics shifted from being overwhelmingly Caucasian to be an overwhelmingly Black population. And one dies, get another. That's actually the title of a book that somebody wrote on the convict leasing program, because it reflects the overwhelming perspective that it was actually more economically it made more economic sense to work people to death. It was more cost effective to work people to death than to keep them alive. And it echoes from an earlier mentality during the transatlantic slave trade, particularly in the earlier days of it, when it was more economically feasible to work people to death rather than have to provide for their needs, like, feed them or healthcare considerations or such like that. And that was until 1807 when the act prohibiting the importation of slaves was implemented. So it sort of switched. Prior to this, you could buy people, fresh from the continent, who land off the boats fresh from the continent, and it was cheaper to work them to death rather than invest in their needs. However, after it was illegal to import Africans, and you had to work with the population that was already in our nation, then the emphasis kind of shifts. And then, you have to maintain an intergenerational system. You have to invest to some extent in healthcare, because you need them to survive, to reproduce the next generation of workers. So this idea of one dies, get another, it sort of replays itself, like within a historical echo, as they say, history rhymes, with the convict leasing system and the Black codes. And it may or may not surprise you to know that the origins of our modern policing system can actually be traced back to slave patrols, which were slave catchers that were hired by property owners to terrorize and squash uprisings, to pursue, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners. And slave patrols existed since the early 1700s in this nation, throughout the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, when they then morphed into militia-like groups that were empowered to control and deny the rights of newly freed slaves. They enforced Black codes and the state laws that regulated and restricted access to labor, wages, voting rights, and general freedoms. And from this foundation, from the foundation of slave patrols to these organized militia groups, local municipalities starting in the 1900s, early 1900s, began to establish police departments to enforce local laws, including Jim Crow laws, which existed, of course, up until the 1960s. So the convict leasing program eventually morphs into another set of laws, codes, and conduct and institutional practices aimed to maintain hierarchy and economic control that we now know as Jim Crow. And of course, this is a direct inheritance from slavery. And the interrelation of slavery and incarceration, it really cannot be overemphasized, particularly when we look at the economic component of each system. The institution of slavery and incarceration both function as profitable ventures under capitalism. Much of the same ideology or rhetoric is or was used to justify each institution, even in our language, like in our word choice, how we use the word abolition, draws on our legacy of slavery in this country. Like an abolitionist is a person who favors the dismantling of an institution, be it slavery or the prison industrial complex. Now, I'm not saying that there is a direct, that prisons are a direct outgrowth of slavery. It's not a 100% corollary, but there are enough similarities in the coercive, racialized functions in each institutions to make a definite comparison. And just as slavery functioned as a coercive, racialized labor force, the massive rise in incarceration in this country, racial sentencing disparities, aggressive campaigns at criminalizing young people, super predators, criminalizing Blackness, public policies rewritten to criminalize more and more people, focusing aggressively and specifically on urban communities of color, creation of laws to maintain the rule of the ruling class and maintain a social hierarchy, the ways in which the carceral reach impoverishes communities, separates families, creates intergenerational disruptions and traumas, they all resound and echo similar disruptions of slavery. And I'm going to turn it over to David now.
I'd like to just go a little bit about what Jen was talking about as far as the convict leasing, because it's something that you see in our prisons to this day. It's not the same way because you have all of these companies that come in and get goods made by the folks that are incarcerated, and they pay them at times 18 cents an hour. So as I said, I'm formerly incarcerated. Alabama has their own correctional industry, so there's different people that'll work in the printing press or make the license plates. And I was making the governor's business cards for about 6 months. And I was making 15 cents an hour for the first 3 months, and I made 30 cents an hour the last 3 months that I worked there. And do you think they were only charging 30 cents a business card? No, they were charging this excessive amount of money, And as Jane was talking about Brian Stevenson. So Brian Stevenson, if you don't know, is founder of Equal Justice Initiative. He does a lot of work towards those individuals who are on death row. And lately, he's been doing a lot of work around racial equity, And so 2017, they opened the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. What's very interesting, and he always talks about, is the U.S. does not want to talk about slavery, does not want to have memorials about slavery. When you think about places like Germany, there's nowhere you can go in Berlin where there's not markers or there's something talking about the Holocaust. And there's no statues of Hitler in Berlin. But here in the US, we don't have any museums that are talking about slavery, that are talking about lynching, except for the Legacy Museum, and the Peace Museum that was created too. And so that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to create a museum that would when you walk through this museum, you see where slavery began in 1619 and how Brian Stevenson always says that slavery did not go away. It just evolved. As Jen eloquently said, that it evolved from slavery to Jim Crow and now to mass incarceration. And it was just another way for people to incarcerate Black and brown individuals and to keep them in subjection. When I first heard of the TV show Orange is the New Black, I didn't understand the aspect of orange being like this new hip thing. I didn't comprehend that. The first thing my mind went to is incarceration is the new form of slavery. So really, that's how my whole mindset was whenever I had heard Orange is the New Black was ever talked about. And if you guys ever get an opportunity, definitely get a chance to go down to Montgomery. And where the Legacy Museum is one of the biggest places of slave trading in the South. Montgomery, Alabama was one of the top places that slaves were brought in and then dispersed throughout the whole country. And it was something that really blew my mind when I heard it first, and then went to the museum when it first opened. But they expanded the museum, and this new museum opened up in October of 2021. You can go to the next slide.
Okay.
And then this is just part of walking through this, where you're seeing these individuals being kidnapped, there's just the whole aspect of terrorism, of just the lynchings, the beatings. And that's what we have to realize, it is part of our history that we have to recognize, and we have to become really cognizant of it and what happened during this time and the lives that were lost. As we go on to the next slide, these are just amazing statues. This is in the lynching museum, and we just think about the lives that were lost, the lives, the generations that were changed because of these lynchings. The next slide shows that there are these different pillars. So EGI did this research. They found, I think it was just over 4,000 individuals that were lynched in the United States. And what they did was they found the counties that these individuals were. They had a lot of people researching this to find out. There were some counties where they had like 100 people lynched at one time. And when you go through this and you read the stories, about the different people that were lynched and where they were lynched, it's just gut-wrenching. It's like this punch to your solar plex, and you're just trying to gasp for air, because of the counties. And some counties had like hundreds of people lynched. When we look at the next slide, this is what was really powerful. Each one of those glass containers has the name of the person that was lynched, and that is actual soil from where the lynching took place. And it's amazing to see it. I heard Brian Stevenson speak the other day in Texas, and he was talking about this story of this Black woman that was at one of the sites, and she was there getting ready to dig the soil, and this big white dude came by and stopped, was curious, stopped, came up and like, "What are you doing?" And this Black woman got scared. She didn't know what to say. And so she finally said, "This is where somebody was lynched, and I'm digging the soil to take it back to Equal Justice Initiative." The man's like, "Can I read the paper?" And so he read the paper about what happened to this individual. And this person's like, "Can I help you?" And so this white guy got down, and the woman offered his shovel, and he's like, "No." And he just started digging into the dirt with his own hands and then slinging the dirt into the container. And at the end of it, both of them were there just crying together. And they each took a picture of each other with the soil, and then they drove together to Equal Justice Initiative and went in and took the jar in together. And it was something that Brian said just like rocked him and touched him so much, because they were able to do this together. And there's so many individuals and so much soil that has been taken there. Next slide, Jim. So this picture right here was me with Brian Stevenson last year. I was actually able to go down and I had my pardon hearing on September 14th of last year, and I was able to obtain a pardon from Alabama. And just thinking about Brian Stevenson and the work that he does, one of his famous quotes is, "The criminal justice system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're innocent and poor." And that's a perfect example of why our system is so full of individuals that are Black and brown skin and the individuals that are poor, because these are people that can't get bond, because they don't have the money. Their family doesn't have the ability to support. I mean, a perfect example is Khalif Browder. He was a teenager that was arrested in New York City for stealing a backpack. he couldn't get bond. His bond was like $500. He spent 3 years on Rikers Island. He was sexually abused by individuals that were there. He was beaten by the corrections officers, beaten by other incarcerated people, and spent months in solitary confinement. Finally, he was released and they dropped the charges. So you would think that after 3 years, he could come out and just everything would be okay. But all the trauma that he experienced after 3 years of being out, he committed suicide because of the traumatic experience that he had on Rikers Island, because he was accused of stealing a backpack that he never stole. Next slide. So the thing that we realize is there were lynchings in Pennsylvania. So in 1911, there was a lynching in Coatesville. Zechariah Walker, he had took the life of somebody who was working at one of the steel mills here in Coatesville. And I live about 5 minutes away from where this lynching took place. And so I was told about it, and I was actually there when they were getting the soil for the EJI museum. And it was just powerful just hearing the story and what had happened. And I never knew that lynching happened this far north, you know? And I think there were like 3 or 4 different lynchings that happened in Pennsylvania. And so just seeing that this isn't something that didn't make it all the way up here was really powerful. And it's like, wow, this racial hatred and animosity is something that was prevalent in Pennsylvania too.
Thank you, David. I want to return to the idea that I spoke of earlier, the idea that we can't assume that we're starting every era, every generation with a clean slate. Rather, we're layering on top of earlier practices, values, and physical structures. And when we want to talk about mass incarceration, we want to talk about the racial climate, the contemporary racial climate in terms of crime and punishment in America, we have to go back to the Great Migration, that happened in this country when waves of African Americans starting in about 1916, over the course of 40 years, 6 million, Black people migrated from the South to the industrial urban North, greatly shifting the demographics of the nation, shifting demographics from rural to urban, shifting demographics from North to South. And now, why did this Great Migration happen? Well, the answer is kind of obvious. And like, for example, many of us can look to our own family histories to answer these questions, but primarily, as in the title, escaping, oh, you can't see it, maybe escaping racist terror, or trying to escape is what it should say. Racial terror, which included lynchings, destruction of property, promise of violence if you break racial codes of behavior, unsatisfactory economic opportunities, segregation, lack of voting rights, and being denied political participation. And people headed north, where they tried to take advantage of, the need for industrial workers. They could start taking a position in life and participating in the cultural production of communities, and also start to confront some of the racial prejudice they were experiencing. However, this wasn't perfect. It wasn't like they escaped the South and landed in the land of milk and honey. They faced really difficult and arduous, often dangerous working conditions, housing discrimination, segregated neighborhoods, restrictive housing covenants, and redlining, and actually practices which still impact the financial disparity between African Americans and the rest of the nation. And perhaps most dramatically, they faced a lot of racial violence. The number of racial massacres and rebellions during this period of time, it actually would just take us too long to talk about. We have a short time tonight, so we can't really get into it. But very briefly, just to name a few, you talk about, 1917 St. Louis, thousands of people were left homeless, a great, racial rebellion and uprising. 1919, Red Summer, where 45 different locations across the nation, just so much tension and terror and experiences in Black communities. In Pennsylvania, you can look at Darby, Philadelphia, Chester, and Coatesville, as David mentioned, for lynchings. In Tulsa in 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre, and these are just like the headlines. These are just the headlines of what was happening, and not the details, which were happening and occurring in every state and in every city. But by the time we get to the 1960s, we're talking about the Watts 1965 rebellion and Chicago 1968. But suffice to say, when we start to look at the dynamics that impacted the 80s to the until now, we have to understand that this isn't new. What's happening and what we see isn't new. It's just it's never been new. It just, every era has a slightly different twist to it to reflect the modern era and the greater political urgencies happening around the country and the world. So competition for jobs, poverty, racism, desperation, lack of opportunities, new drugs being funneled into neighborhoods, burgeoning freedom movements, at home, and anti-imperialist struggles abroad. All of this contributes to the reality of race, politics, policing, and prisons. And always, as always, there's conflicting analysis and different understandings about why these uprisings are happening and what their root causes were and who's to blame and what to do about the problem. So by the time we get to, by the time we start looking at race issues in northern cities and the response to all the quote, social dynamite that's happening, then, again, we have to understand that nothing here is new, that there's always been, since there were waves of migration to these northern areas, there's always been tension and, different ideas on how to handle the quote problem. So for example, do you take a city like Philadelphia, and as far back as 1899, when W.E.B. Du Bois published his seminal sociological epic work, Philadelphia, he pinpointed all these issues of police and policing and poverty as problems in the city. A man, Matthew Countryman, who wrote Up South, Civil Rights and Black Power in Philadelphia, also talks about, that the cities have been dealing with these issues for generations and generations and generations. So the history of poverty, racism, police misconduct, and brutality, and for example, in Philadelphia, is a long and contentious one. There have always been, similar to Chicago and New York City and, other big cities, there's always been these red light areas called vice districts, which were synonymous with Black neighborhoods. And vice district, of course, are where all the gambling, prostitution, drugs and crime takes place. And what happens is that city officials and crooked politicians were paid off to, they paid off the police to allow these vice activities to happen in these neighborhoods, which of course had a great utilitarian value. They profited from the crime. It gave them a rationale for policing Black neighborhoods, and it allowed social scientists, which at this time, believe it or not, was a new discipline, and it was fueled off these foundations and these racial constructs that they created in advance, to come in and make racist and reductionist assumptions about why crime existed in Black neighborhoods, claiming it was nature and not environment or nurture. Moreover, it gives the police a rationale to come in and violently beat up Black people. So creating and maintaining a construct of urban Black criminality, this idea of urban Black criminality, has always been profitable. Profitable to the politicians who made money off of it, profitable to the social scientists and the policymakers who built careers off of it, and profitable to the police whose livelihood and income depended on the maintenance of it. I want to make a slide. Now, in a way, it's kind of, it's almost misleading to highlight Nixon and Reagan, because one point I really want to make is that when it comes to, race and crime and policing, it's always been a bipartisan handshake. If we had more time, we could go through Lyndon B. Johnson and how his response to crime and poverty and how he began to adopt some of these aggressive, tough talking stances on crime and criminals that the Republicans are actually very famous for, with his war on poverty and war on crime, I guess anything to detract from the real war, which is in Vietnam. In a way, he set the foundation upon which Nixon comes in, and then, Reagan was governor at the time, it comes in, very loud national figures. And then as president, Clinton takes the ball and runs with this. But what's important is also to look at what's happening internationally. How is this stage set for this tough on crime policies to emerge? And so it's important to look at what's happening. If we look at the year 1968, when Nixon comes to power, it's the time of the Vietnam War. It's the shadow of these very shocking political assassinations, such as Malcolm X, such as John F. Kennedy, such as Robert F. Kennedy, such as MLK. And when you look internationally, we look at Che Guevara in Bolivia and Patrice Lumumba in Congo, and we look at the rise of feminism and gay rights and Black Power movements and the Black Panthers, and all the student lefty movements in America and global anti-imperial movements abroad happening all over the world. And, worse, groups like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense were connecting the dots, and then between what was happening abroad, colonialism and imperialism abroad, and linking it to capitalism and underdevelopment in their own neighborhoods. And Nixon hated that. And what was his response? His response was to beef up police departments, to disrupt, discredit, this is a direct quote, disrupt, discredit, and destroy Black militants versus the COINTELPRO program. And sometimes this involved outright assassinations, such as Fred Hampton in Chicago in 1969. And additionally, to destroy the American Indian movement and the Young Lord movement, which were primarily Afro Puerto Ricans and Afro-Latinos, and he called radicals bums. Following the police killings in Jackson State campus, which preceded Kent State by a couple weeks, he said, what are we gonna do to get more respect for the police from our young people after they just killed people on campus? He promised law and order. He promised to silence activists and use whatever force necessary to maintain control. And importantly, he emphasized the role of drugs in crime and criminality. One of the former counsel and assistant to the president for domestic affairs, a man named John Ehrlichman, I think, he said, this is a quote, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. And he also says this, and it's a direct quote. And if you've watched the documentary, The 13th on Netflix, you'll have heard this. He says, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And that's a direct quote. Now, of course, at the national level, you've got politicians like Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and others in, just voicing this great backlash to civil rights, anti-war, anti-police movements. And this was one of the direct causes of the whole lock 'em up rhetoric, which became a rallying cry for politicians, and nobody epitomized this, or exemplifies this more than the self-proclaimed toughest cop in America, the vile human known as Frank Rizzo, Philadelphia mayor. So Rizzo didn't invent anti-Black rhetoric or pro-cop ideas. They were always floating around, but he was very much a galvanizing and energizing force and sort of a mouthpiece. He ran on appealing to white identity politics. He was, a mouthpiece for those ideas. He blatantly encouraged Philadelphians to vote white, and that's a direct quote. He unleashed baton-wielding cops on protesting high school students. And he was quoted as encouraging the cops to get their Black asses, and he infamously ordered the cops to raid the Black Panther Party in Philadelphia. That's the picture on the top, by strip searching them and detaining them in the middle of the night and destroying and ransacking their office. And again, it's important to note, I really want to make this point, Rizzo was a Democrat up until the final 5 years of his career, when he switched to being a Republican. So, when it comes to mass incarceration, it's always been a bipartisan handshake, across the aisle handshake. After being a police officer, he ran for mayor. And you know, very much sort of set the standard of a kind of a blue collar conservatism, which rejected liberal policies and you know, based on culturally defined ideas of privilege, disadvantage, class and race identity and entitlement. And we shouldn't view him as a single operator. You know, I'm pulling him out as an example because we're talking about Pennsylvania, and because he's, you know, nationally known and so renowned for this. But he embodied, and he didn't create it, but he embodied and articulated a white stance to race and economics. And even though, you know, he's one person, we can see how police aggression in general starts to lead to mass incarceration with increased police budgets, militarization, you know, just sort of this developing this us other. I have to kind of rush through it because we're running out of time. So I'm going to be talking very fast or not going into as much detail as we normally would. But just this idea of creating this, you know, this way and understanding of who the criminals were and who polices them. And then again, district attorneys, we can't ever, you know, avoid looking at the role of district attorneys. For example, district attorneys start to have more power. They have excessive power. Still to this day, they run largely unchallenged in many places around the country. They determine, you know, bail. They influence sentencing. They negotiate plea deals, and they, you know, they influence what evidence is considered acceptable and the policy surrounding that. And so finally, we come to this era where it's like they'll lock them up and throw away the key era. Author Michelle Alexander and former law professor and author of The New Jim Crow, she says, convictions for drugs are the single most important cause of the explosion of incarceration in the United States. So this, quote, war on drugs is initiated actually at a time when drug usage is down. Crack doesn't start to hit the scene until a couple years into it. In order to get buy-in and compliance from law enforcement, they were given huge cash grants, you know, and made to various law enforcement agencies. Federal grant money was allocated. The DEA provided free training and tech support. The Pentagon gave away millions and millions of dollars worth of firepower to state and legal agencies, and a change in the forfeiture law made it so that state and local law enforcement were granted authority to keep the vast majority of assets that they seized during drug raids, such as cars, property, and homes. And new laws were created. Remember about the Black codes, it's very similar. New laws were created, stiffer penalties were enforced, shifts were made between what could be considered a felony, you know, what with once a misdemeanor is now considered a felony. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act, 3 strikes you're out, and mandatory minimums increased sentencing. The Fourth Amendment is challenged. That's a search and seize amendment, and it allowed police and law enforcement to make pretext stops. And all of this is disproportionately aimed at poor urban Black communities. And again, a bipartisan effort. You know, if we had time, we could talk a little bit more. It's so important to hear the voices of people who have experienced this on the inside, but we don't have time for that. You know, but in short, a steady stream of criminals is needed to keep the system going. Sentences are longer. You know, behaviors that have to count more as crimes begins to grow. Certain behaviors that now count as crimes begin to grow, and at all costs, the category of criminal has to perpetuate. It's really important to hear the voices from people inside, and you really start to hear in the most intimate way possible, you know, what the outcome of all these policies means. It means, you know, people separated from loved ones. It means years of life, warehoused in cages. I mean, it means losing your property, your family, and jobs, and even short periods of time incarcerated can cause major disruptions in your life. It means going to prison instead of to college. It means a lifetime of, sometimes in some cases, a lifetime of political disenfranchisement. It means not being eligible for social programs, federally funded college loans, and housing options. It means being subjected to continued carceral control even after release. Or as my colleague, one of my colleagues said, who spent 20 years incarcerated, he says, now that I'm out, it's like I'm free, but I'm not. The shackles are still there. They're just invisible now. I'm going to let David take it from here.
Actually, Jen, can you just go to our slides at the end past this stuff, since we
Sure.
only have like a couple minutes. So
Yeah.
one of the main things, as she's flipping through, these are just some slides about the prisons that have been built since the 90s here in Pennsylvania. And there's this huge influx. SEI Laurel Highlands that she just showed is the prison hospital. That's where the individuals are that are sent there to die, you know. So in Pennsylvania, we have 5,447 people serving life without parole. And one of the bills that we're working on is straight ahead is to get the parole eligibility for lifers. And so that's SB 135. And the other bill is we're working on parole for geriatric and individuals with medical issues. And so, I mean, it's going to take everybody in Pennsylvania to help get these passed, you know. And as somebody who's been formerly incarcerated, I mean, I know the importance of this. I went to prison when I was 20 years old on a murder charge. I received a 25-year sentence in Alabama, served 13 and a half. I've been out almost 9 years. And so this is something that I'm really passionate about because I've been there. If my offense happened in Pennsylvania, I could have easily received a life without parole sentence, because if you're sentenced to first or second degree murder in Pennsylvania, it's automatic life without parole. It's a mandatory minimum sentence. And so that's why we have the second largest number of individuals serving life without parole. 1 out of 10 people serving life without parole in the United States are in Pennsylvania. And this is a population we're fighting for. You know, we are trying to get them the ability just to have a parole date, you know, just to have that hope of being able to be released. And we're hoping that this open your eyes some. And just look at Mr. Lagone, you know, he was released last year. He was 15 years old when he went to prison, was given a life without parole sentence, served 68 years in prison. When they told him, because of the Miller versus Alabama and Montgomery versus Louisiana rulings, that he could get out of prison, he's like, no, I don't want to get out of prison because you're going to keep me on parole and potentially send me back to prison. So finally they said, okay, we're just going to give you time served and let you out. And that's what caused him and allowed him to come out. And he's been out for a year now. And it's people like him who we're fighting for. So we'll go ahead and open up for questions now.
The one question we have so far is they want to know more about what the bills are that you're working on. Specifically would be SB 135 and SB 835. If you could tell us a little about them and why it's necessary to allow lifers to go up for parole versus commutation.
So commutation is like winning the lotto. And I mean, it's a process that is a lot harder than parole. The SB 135 is a bill that would allow people who have been convicted of first degree murder, they would be eligible for parole after serving 35 years. And for second degree would be eligible after 25 years, and then they'd be eligible for parole. SB 835 is a bill that says anybody that's 55 years or older would be eligible for parole if they've served 25 years or half of their sentence. And so this isn't just for individuals serving life without parole. This is for individuals who are given virtual life sentences. So virtual life sentences are those sentences where somebody has been given a 30 or 40 or longer sentence, you know. So in Pennsylvania, at times what they give you is a 40 to 80 year sentence. And so we call that a virtual life sentence because typically the individuals are going to prison anywhere between 18 to 25, which is the age of a majority of people that go to prison with a life without parole sentence. 73% of the people serving life without parole were 25 and younger. 50% were 21 and younger. So that's something that we have to realize, that these individuals are so young when they're going to prison, you know, and that we need to offer this support. And commutation back in the 1970s was, they used it as a parole by proxy, where over about 30% of the people that were in prison during that time were getting a commutation, and the usual time length of that time was 18 to 22 years. And currently we have individuals, so Irvin Moore was just released from prison last year. He's been out of prison 9 months. He went to prison 52 years ago. He served 52 years and just received a commutation.
I didn't know you knew him, David.
Yeah, he spoke at park the other day. Yeah, we're gonna reach out to
Yeah,
him
he's
more.
he's lives in my town. Great, amazing guy. Just amazing guy. Mhm.
Can you explain why Pennsylvania has such a high proportion of people in prison serving life without parole or death by incarceration versus other states? I think you said that Pennsylvania has the second highest population of people serving life parole. And I believe that Pennsylvania is one of only 6 states where every life sentence is life without parole.
So the reason we have so many people is that it goes back to 1941. 1941 is when Pennsylvania began giving out life without parole sentences. We were the 3rd state to do this, behind Vermont and Maine, and they really have stopped giving out these sentences. But what Pennsylvania has done is we have made this a mandatory minimum. So we are 1 out of 6 states that give life without parole as the only option for first-degree murder, and we are 1 of 2 states that give life without parole as the only option for second degree. So when you have that, you take all discretion away from the judge. If somebody goes to trial on first or second degree murder, it doesn't matter the circumstances. If they are found guilty, the judge has to give them a life without parole sentence. So if my case happened in Pennsylvania, my brother and I were sexually physically abused for 8 years. We took the person's life, and we received a murder charge in Alabama and was given 25 years. If that offense happened in Pennsylvania, we could have easily been charged with first or second degree murder. And if we took it to trial, we would have been given life without parole, and we would still be in prison to this day. But both of us have been released on parole in Alabama, and both of us have received a pardon.
What's the difference between first and second degree murder?
A lot of it is just how they charge it. So a lot of times your first degree murder are going to be your 1 or multiple murders, and then also if you have a felony that is involved with a murder. And then at times it's the severity or how the individuals is murdered. A lot of your accomplices. So the thing with Pennsylvania is we have this thing called felony murder. So felony murder is what is a charge when you have an accomplice. So if Jen and I are out one night and Jen decides to kill somebody and I'm just in the car, Jen isn't the only one that's being charged with first degree murder or second degree murder. I'm going to be charged too because I was an accomplice with her. I was there. Even though I did not have any part in the murder, I wasn't the primary. Because I was there, I'm going to be charged with second degree murder and get life without parole.
Which actually happened to our executive director when he was 16 years old. He was an accomplice to a crime.
And he was actually charged with first degree murder as a 16-year-old.
Mm-hmm. And he served, I mean, he was sentenced to life without possibility of parole, and only when the state laws changed to when the juvenile lifer law changed in Pennsylvania did he get out.
And just to think about it too, I mean, what's amazing about Straight Ahead is we have 3 people on our staff who actually served time in prison for murder. So we are able to use our stories when we're talking with representatives and senators and show them that, okay, we're not fighting for just this person. We are individuals who could easily still be in prison to this day. And we are examples of what these men and women are capable of doing once those doors are opened.
One more question. A lot of people think that releasing murderers is a dangerous tack, that they're violent and it's risky to release them from prison. And we're talking about since it's become illegal to sentence juveniles to life without parole. What is the recidivism rate of people released from prison from life sentences for any other kind of crime?
For any other crime? Really, when you think about it, the recidivism rates, the two populations that have the lowest recidivism rate are people who've committed murder and people who've committed sexual offense. Both of those are within single digits. To put it into more perspective, so Pennsylvania had about 500 juveniles serving life without parole. There's been about 287 of those individuals released. 6 have been rearrested, but only 2 have gone back to prison. And they were for low-level, like third-degree robbery charges. And the other one was for a contempt charge. And so this is a perfect example of individuals who went to prison at a young age and have been able to have their trajectory changed, and they're not committing other offenses. You know, they have come out, they're pillars in their community, as Jennifer said. I mean, our executive director was a juvenile lifer. He went to prison at 16, served 27 years. He's been out over 3 years. He's been on panels, traveled the country, speaking and sharing his story, you know, and we're not anomalies. You know, people who commit offenses at a young age, there's this thing called life course theory, and in it is a part where it talks about early onset offending. And what that means is somebody commits an offense at a young age and they age out of crime, and there's some type of situation that happens in their life that changes their trajectory. A lot of times it's being incarcerated. If you went into any prison in Pennsylvania right now and asked the corrections officer who they would release today, 99% of them would say certain lifers at that prison, because of the way that they keep the prisons contained. And they're the ones that are educating. They're the ones that are pouring into these men and women to help them to, when they get out of prison, not to recidivate and to end up back in prison. They are the people that are breaking that cycle. They're shutting down that revolving door.
Last question, I promise. What else can we do about this issue in addition to supporting these bills? And maybe you might want to put in a plug for the one bill that we don't want to support on
SB 913.
Yes, that one.
Yeah, so SB 913 is the probation bill that if you were just told about it, it would be good. But definitely it's gonna cause more headaches and give the individuals more power, give the district attorney and probation officers more power. So I'd say really the thing to do is to go back to your congregations and to have these conversations. You know, it's for us to pass any of these bills, we can't just totally rely on senators and representatives. We need constituents. We need the faith community to get involved and to be part of this conversation. So something else is April 19th, we're going to be doing an interfaith panel, and we're going to have some different people from a Muslim community. We're going to have a rabbi. We're going to have somebody from the Black clergy. And we're also going to have Shane Claiborne on this conversation. And so it's going to be talking about life without parole sentences, death by incarceration, and just the thought process about second chances and how people of faith, we're supposed to look at people not as the single thing that they did, because when God views us, he doesn't view us as a sinner. He views us and he sees Jesus because we're clothed with his righteousness, and so I think that's really what we have to do. We have to go back to our congregations and we have to have these conversations, and we need to reach out to our senators. That's one thing that we're doing a lot of. If any of you guys are interested in doing any lobbying and want to talk to your representative or senators, definitely reach out to me. Because that is one of the items that I am working on, is having individuals across the state, and helping them to be able to go have conversations with their senators and their legislators, because your voice matters, because each one of you helps them stay in office or get elected or get kicked out of office, And I mean, it's one thing for me to come out to Pittsburgh and talk to some of the representatives and senators out there, but it's a whole nother thing when you are talking to them because they rely on your vote.
Jen and David, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for showing up. Again, the next forum will be on, get back into my notes, on March 24th. It's on maternal health disparities in Western PA, and we hope you will join us for that. Thank you everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, y'all.
Yeah, great to talk to you.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.